Rushed to the oncology ward at St. Catherine's Medical Center on a Tuesday morning in November, and I remember thinking the hallways smelled like floor wax and bad news. That combination, antiseptic and dread, it does something to you. Makes your legs heavy, makes everything slow down in a way that has nothing to do with time. I wasn't supposed to be there. I was supposed to be at work. I had a 9 o'clock call with the regional office, a stack of project files sitting open on my desk at home, and a cup of coffee I'd left on the kitchen counter that was probably ice cold by now. But instead, I was walking down a hospital corridor on the 4th floor, holding a piece of paper with a room number written on it in my own handwriting, going to confront a man I had never met. A man my wife had been visiting every week for 4 months without telling me. Let me back up. My name is not important, but I'll tell you who I am. I'm 61 years old. I spent 32 years working in civil engineering, bridges, mostly highway infrastructure projects across 3 states. I retired early a couple years ago after a back surgery that didn't go quite the way they promised. My wife and I live in a house we bought in 1997 in a suburb outside Columbus, Ohio. We have 2 adult kids. Our son lives in Denver. Our daughter is in Philadelphia. We have a dog named Hank, who is old and slow and spends most of his day on the back porch, like he's waiting for something. My wife's name is Catherine. We've been married 34 years. I thought I knew everything about her. I thought that was the reward for staying, for choosing each other through layoffs and miscarriages and a flooded basement in the year our son didn't speak to either of us. You put in the decades and eventually you stop being strangers and you become something else, something quieter and more permanent. That's what I believed. I found out I was wrong on a Sunday afternoon in October when I accidentally picked up her phone thinking it was mine. They're the same model. Same dark gray case. I picked it up off the kitchen island, saw what I thought was a text from our daughter, and unlocked it with my thumb before I realized it wasn't my phone at all. The text wasn't from our daughter. It said, "Doing okay today. Had a rough night, but the morning was better. Thank you for coming last Thursday. It meant everything." The contact name was just initials, 2 letters, no last name. I set the phone back down exactly where I found it. I walked to the back porch and sat next to Hank and stared at the yard for a long time. I didn't say anything to Catherine that night, or the next morning. I've never been the kind of man who acts before he understands. That's not patience exactly. It's more like a reflex. I worked in engineering long enough to know that the worst structural failures happen when someone assumes they understand the load before they've actually measured it. You don't pull on something until you know what it's holding up. So I watched. Over the next 2 weeks, I paid attention in ways I hadn't in years. I noticed she left the house every Thursday around 10 in the morning and came back around 2. She always said she was going to her book club or running errands or meeting her friend Joanne for lunch. I never questioned it because why would I? She's my wife. We trust each other. Or we did. I checked. Joanne hadn't had lunch with Catherine in months. I looked at our bank account. We still have a shared checking account, old-fashioned, I know. And I found a pattern of small ATM withdrawals every Thursday. Cash. $40, $60 at a time. Not unusual on its own, but consistent. Every single Thursday for at least 4 months, as far back as I could pull the statements. I'm not proud of what I did next. I followed her. Not close. I stayed 2 or 3 cars back on the highway and told myself I was doing the right thing, that a man had a right to know what was happening in his own marriage, that this wasn't an invasion of privacy. It was self-preservation. I told myself a lot of things during that 40-minute drive. She pulled into St. Catherine's Medical Center. I thought that was strange, the name. Same name as my wife. I sat in the parking lot and watched her walk through the front entrance carrying a paper bag, the kind from a deli, handled like she'd brought someone lunch. I sat there for 2 hours. When she came out, she wasn't crying, but she looked tired in a way that's different from regular tired. There's a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from being emotionally present for someone else for a long period of time. I know that look. I saw it on her face every evening during the year my father was dying. It's not sadness exactly. It's more like being emptied out slowly. I went home before she did. I made sure I was back at my desk with my headphones on when she came through the door. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay there in the dark next to my wife and I thought about 34 years. I thought about every fight we ever had, every anniversary, every ordinary Tuesday when nothing happened. And that was enough. I thought about whether I had missed something, whether there had been signs I dismissed or explanations I accepted without examining. I'm an engineer. I build things that are supposed to hold. And I lay there wondering if I had somehow missed the fracture point in the most important structure of my life. I got her phone when she was in the shower the next morning. I found a thread of text going back to March. 19 weeks. The contact, those two initials, had sent messages like, "Not a great day. Hard to stay positive." And the results came back. Not what we were hoping. And once, in July, I don't know how much longer, my wife's responses were gentle and consistent. Things like, "I'm coming Thursday, don't worry," and "You're not alone in this." I mean it. Not a single message looked romantic, but they looked intimate. The kind of intimate that comes from sustained closeness, from being let into something most people aren't allowed to see. I found the room number in a photo she'd saved, a picture of a whiteboard in a hospital room, some kind of schedule written on it, and the room number visible in the corner, 418. That was the piece of paper I was holding when I walked down the fourth-floor hallway. I stopped outside room 418 and put my hand flat against the door and stood there for probably 30 seconds. I could hear a television on low inside. A game show, I think. I told myself I wasn't going to be angry. I told myself I was just going to look, just going to know, and then I would figure out the rest later. I'm a measured man. That's what I told myself. I pushed the door open. The man in the bed was old, not older than me in the way people sometimes say about someone who is 65 or 70. I mean genuinely old, 80s maybe. He was small in the way that serious illness makes people small, like the body has started the long work of returning to something minimal. He had thin, white hair and hands that rested on the blanket like they weighed nothing. He was watching the television mounted on the wall, and when the door opened, he turned to look at me with eyes that were pale gray and very still. He didn't look afraid. He looked like a man who had run out of things to be afraid of. Behind him, sitting in the chair beside the bed, was my wife. She saw me and went completely white. Nobody spoke for a long moment. The game show kept going. Someone won something, there was applause, and then it faded into a commercial. The old man looked at me, then looked at Catherine, then back at me. He said in a voice that was quiet but not weak, "Is this him?" My wife said, "Yes." He nodded slowly, like that confirmed something he'd already suspected. I said, "Catherine, who is this?" She stood up. She wasn't crying, but her hands were pressed together in front of her like she was trying to hold herself still. She said, "His name is Alfred. He's your father." I have replayed that sentence in my mind approximately 10,000 times since that morning. I have turned it over and examined it from every angle the way you examine a load-bearing beam that doesn't look right. I have looked for the flaw in it, the place where it can't hold the weight of what it's claiming. I still haven't found it. Here is what I didn't know about myself until I was 61 years old. I was adopted at 14 months old. My parents, the people who raised me, who are both gone now, never told me. I had no reason to suspect it. I look enough like my father that a few of my cousins used to joke I had gotten all the good features and left nothing for the rest of them. There was never a moment of doubt. I was theirs. They were mine. That was the entire story as far as I knew it. My wife knew something I didn't. She had found out 18 months ago, before any of this started. She had been going through some of my mother's things. My mother passed 4 years ago, but Catherine had held on to a box of her personal papers, meaning to go through them eventually, and finally did. Inside, she found a sealed envelope addressed to me in my mother's handwriting, with a note on the outside that said, "For my son, when the time seems right." Catherine opened it. Inside was a letter my mother had written sometime in the last year of her life. It explained everything. the adoption, the name of the agency, the name of the man who had given me up, a young man at the time, unmarried, not ready, a man who had spent the next 6 decades looking for me off and on, who had eventually found me through a DNA testing site, one of those ancestry databases, and who had reached out through the agency's updated contact system 2 years ago. The letter said my mother had been afraid to tell me. She was afraid of what it might mean for how I remembered my childhood, for how I felt about her and my father. She said she had planned to tell me in person, and then she got sick, and then she was gone, and the letter stayed in the box. Catherine had read it, and instead of giving it to me, she had gone to find him herself first. I stood in that hospital room and I looked at my wife and I felt about 6 different things simultaneously, none of them clean. She said, I needed to know if he was real, if it was safe. I didn't want to hand you a letter and then have you go find out he was, I don't know. I needed to know who he was before I asked you to deal with knowing he existed. I said, that wasn't your call to make. She said, I know. The old man in the bed, Alfred, was watching us. He said, she told me about you every time she came. Every Thursday I know you from her. He paused. You sound angry. You should be. But she did it to protect you. People make bad decisions for good reasons sometimes. I looked at him. At the IV line in his arm, at the medication chart clipped to the footboard, at the get well cards on the windowsill, which were sparse 2 or 3, not the crowded sill of someone surrounded by people. I said, how long do you have? He said, they stopped telling me specifics a while back. That's usually the answer. I nodded. I sat down in the other chair in the room, the one near the window, without being invited to. I don't entirely know why. I think some part of me, the part that doesn't check with the rest of me before it acts, decided I was not leaving. We sat there for a while without talking. Catherine stood near the door. Alfred watched the television. I looked at his hands. He had the same knuckle configuration I do, wide at the base, the first joint slightly pronounced. I've always had unusual hands for an engineer. People have commented on it. Big, broad-knuckled hands that look like they belong to someone who works outside, even though I've spent most of my life at a drafting table or in front of a screen. I looked at his hands and I thought, there it is. There's the thing you can't explain away. I said, what was your work? He said, roofing, when I was young. Then I ran a small hardware store in Dayton for about 25 years, retired when my knees gave out. I said, Dayton. He said, 40 minutes from here, more or less. I've been 40 minutes from you your whole life. That hit me somewhere I wasn't prepared for. I went back to the parking lot alone and sat in my car for a long time. Catherine came out after about 20 minutes and stood by the passenger door. I unlocked it. She got in. She said, I'm sorry. I know that's not enough. I said, what were you going to do? Just keep going every Thursday until he died and then tell me afterward? What was the plan? She looked straight ahead. She said, I kept almost telling you. Every week I came back, I thought, tonight, and then I'd get home and see you, and I'd think, what if it breaks something? What if you look at your childhood differently? What if you feel like your parents lied to you, and it ruins the way you remember them? Your dad has been gone 12 years. Your mom is gone. They can't explain themselves. I didn't want to take away something you couldn't get back. I said, you took away something I couldn't get back anyway. You took away time. She didn't say anything to that. I want to be clear about something. I did not handle the next several weeks gracefully. I'm not telling this story to make myself look like a man who rose above everything cleanly, because I didn't. I slept in the guest room for almost 3 weeks. I was short with my wife in ways that were beneath me. I called my son and told him a heavily edited version of events, and then regretted it. I went to see a therapist, a man in his 50s who wore reading glasses on a chain and had a very steady way of listening. And I sat in his office and cried in a way I haven't cried since my mother's funeral. What I did do after the first week was go back to the hospital. I went on a Thursday. Old habits, I guess. Or maybe I just wanted to see if he'd still be there. He was. We talked for 3 hours. He told me about his life, the roofing years, the store, 2 marriages. The first ended early, no children. The second, longer, a woman named Margaret who had died 8 years ago. He told me he had tried to find me twice before the DNA database, both times running into dead ends because sealed adoption records in Ohio in the early 1960s were nearly impenetrable. He told me he was not asking me for anything. He said that very directly, early on, like he wanted to clear the air before we got into anything else. He said, "I'm not looking for a son at this point. I had my life. I don't want you to feel like you owe me a relationship or grief or anything. I just wanted to look at you. Just once." I said, "You've looked at me several times now." He said, "Fair point." And he almost smiled. I asked him what he knew about why he'd given me up. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he had been 23, no money, working seasonal roofing jobs in the fall and living on unemployment in the winter. And the woman who was my biological mother, they had not been together long. It was complicated. Had the baby and then left the state, and he had been left with a 14-month-old he genuinely did not know how to care for. He said he had thought about it for months before deciding. He said he thought about it every year after. He said he told himself the decision was the right one, and that I had probably had a good life, and that had to be enough. He said most of the time he believed it. I told him he was right. I had a good life. My parents, the people who raised me, were good people. My childhood was not perfect, but it was full of the right things. I told him I didn't blame him for the decision, and I meant it when I said it, which surprised me a little. He said, "Your wife told me you build bridges." I said, "Built? I'm retired." He said, "She showed me a picture. One of the ones that's in the newspaper. The overpass on Route 23, the one they rebuilt a few years back." I said I was on that project. He looked at the ceiling. He said, "I drove under that bridge probably 200 times in the last 10 years, going back and forth to my sister's place in Marion. Didn't know it." He paused. "Funny thing. I went back the next Thursday, and the one after that. The last time I saw Alfred was in January. He had declined pretty significantly by then, sleeping more, eating less, the particular shrinking that happens at the end. My wife came with me that day, the first time we had gone together. She sat in her usual chair by the bed, and I sat in mine by the window, and we talked about ordinary things for a while. The weather, a documentary about the national parks that Alfred had watched twice because he liked the cinematography. At some point, he fell asleep mid-sentence, just drifted off quietly with his hands folded on the blanket. Catherine and I sat there in the silence for a while. Outside the window, it was gray and still. The kind of Ohio winter that makes everything look like it's holding its breath. She reached across and put her hand over mine. I didn't move away. I'm not going to tell you our marriage went back to normal immediately after that, because it didn't. There was a long period of renegotiation, not dramatic, not explosive, just a slow, careful work of two people who are trying to understand how something shifted and whether the structure still holds. We went to counseling together for several months. Some sessions were useful. Some were just two people sitting in chairs trying to find the right words. Alfred passed in February. Quietly, the hospice nurse said, "In the night." I went to the small service his remaining family held. A niece and her husband, a couple of old friends from Dayton. I sat in the back. Nobody knew who I was. I didn't introduce myself. Afterward, I drove home on the highway, and when I passed the overpass on Route 23, I slowed down for a moment. Just to look at it, the concrete clean and gray against the winter sky, the expansion joints we designed to handle the freeze-thaw cycles, the way the grade eases off gently on both approaches so the transition feels smooth. A good piece of work. Built to last. I thought about 40 minutes. About a man who drove under a bridge 200 times and didn't know. I thought about what it means to spend your whole life building something solid and then find out the foundation was different than you thought. And whether that makes the structure weaker or just different, or whether it means anything about the structure at all. My wife was in the kitchen when I got home. She was making something. I could smell it from the front door. She turned when I came in and looked at me the way she's been looking at me lately, the way she used to look at me when I came home from long trips when the kids were small. Like she wasn't completely sure I'd come back and was glad I did. I hung up my coat. I said, "It smells good." She said, "Pot roast. It'll be another hour." I said, "Okay." I sat down at the kitchen table and Hank came over and put his chin on my knee and I scratched behind his ears. Outside the window, the yard was bare and still, everything waiting for spring. There are things I will not get back. Time with a man I never knew existed. The chance to have the conversation my mother owed me when I was young enough that it might have changed something. The 19 Thursdays my wife drove to that hospital before I ever knew there was a reason to go. But I've been an engineer long enough to know that you don't tear down a bridge because you find something unexpected in the foundation. You take the measurements. You understand what you're dealing with. You figure out if the load is still being carried. Ours is. That's the whole story, or most of it. The part I can tell. I've thought a lot about cause and effect since all of this happened. Not in any mystical way. I'm not built for that. But I do believe that most of what comes back to us in life is something we set in motion ourselves, even when we can't see the connection in the moment. Catherine made a choice to open that letter and not tell me. That choice came from love. I understand that now. But it still caused damage. Real damage. The kind that doesn't announce itself loudly, but shows up quietly at 2 in the morning when you're lying in the dark, trying to decide if you're angry or just sad. The harm wasn't in her intention. The harm was in the assumption that she knew better than I did what I could handle. That's a mistake we make for people we love sometimes. We protect them from things they had every right to decide for themselves. And eventually, the thing you were protecting them from finds them anyway, except now there's a second wound on top of the first one. That's the cause and effect I keep coming back to. Not punishment, just consequence. The natural result of a decision, following it home, what I've had to work on, and I mean actually work on, the way you work on anything that doesn't come easily, is the difference between understanding and excusing. I understand why my wife did what she did. That doesn't mean it was right. Both of those things can be true at the same time. And sitting with that tension without collapsing it in one direction or the other, that's harder than it sounds. It takes something from you to stay in that uncomfortable middle place instead of just deciding someone is either all good or all wrong and moving on. But I think staying there is what honest people owe each other. Alfred said something to me during one of those Thursday visits that I've carried with me. He said people make bad decisions for good reasons sometimes. He said it very simply, like it was just a fact about the world, the way you'd say it rains more in spring. No bitterness in it, no performance. Just a man at the end of his life who had made some bad decisions for reasons that probably felt good at the time and had arrived at a place of plain honesty about it. That kind of honesty takes a long time to grow. It requires you to stop defending yourself and just look at the thing clearly. I'm still learning to do that. At 61, I'm still learning it. What I know is this. The integrity of a structure isn't measured by whether it was built perfectly. It's measured by whether it holds under load. My marriage held. My sense of who I am held differently than before, maybe, shaped a little differently by what I found out, but still fundamentally mine. The story of my childhood didn't change. My parents loved me. That's not a smaller truth, because the biological facts turned out to be different. Love is a choice people make every day, and my parents made it for 61 years. That's not nothing. That's everything. I don't know what I would have done if I'd found out differently. If the door at room 418 had opened onto something uglier, I'd like to think I would have handled it with the same steadiness. But I honestly don't know. What I do know is that I showed up. When it mattered, I sat down in that chair by the window and I stayed. That's the only thing I can say with certainty that I did right. Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes just staying is the whole answer.